For much of human history, wars were incredibly brutal. They weren't cheap morally, but cheap logistically. Armies were made up of the people they already had. Weapons were their own, albeit ineffective means. Campaigns were short, seasonal, and limited by hunger, weather, and distance. Kings didn't need accountants to wage war. They needed loyalty, horses, and time. War had vast limitations. Just as life did, soldiers had fields to go to. When food ran out, armies disbanded. If a ruler went too far, loyalty broke, harvests failed, and power crumbled under its own weight. No treasury could sustain endless conflict because no treasury was expected to do so. The system enforced constraints without laws, committees, or budgets. War ended when survival demanded it. Then an invention changed everything. Gunpowder didn't just make war more destructive, it made war more expensive. And when war became expensive, it ceased to be a test of courage and became a test of finance. Welcome to the Financial Historian, a place where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is as simple as it seems. Before gunpowder, power was fragmented. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of lords, vassals, and vassals. Armies were temporary, peasants were summoned, brought to war, and sent home at harvest time. Knights procured their own armor. Castles were defensive structures, not means of expansion. War depended on the people who still had to live. If too much was demanded of a ruler, armies would dwindle. Food would run out. Loyalty would break. The system automatically punished excess. There was no mechanism to prolong war beyond society's limits of tolerance. Conflict ended not because leaders chose peace, but because reality forced restraint. Then gunpowder arrived quietly in Europe in the late Middle Ages. At first it didn't seem impressive. The first cannons were unreliable, firearms were slow, inaccurate, and cumbersome. Traditional elites dismissed them as noisy and bizarre things. They were wrong, but not for the reason most people thought. Gunpowder wasn't important because it killed knights. It was important because it killed cheap warfare. Cannons transformed siege warfare almost overnight. Stone walls that had protected cities for centuries crumbled under constant bombardment. Castles had to be redesigned, lower, thicker, angled. This required engineers, materials, time, and above all, money. Firearms also transformed armies. Training a knight took a lifetime. Training a musketeer took months, but only if the state could afford the weapons, gunpowder, logistics, and constant supplies. Wars were no longer fought with what soldiers carried on their backs, but with what states knew how to deliver to the front. War ceased to be local. It became industrial. Standing armies replaced feudal troops. Soldiers were no longer occasional fighting farmers. They became professionals requiring year-round salaries. Armies no longer disbanded after campaigns. Even in peacetime, they waited, trained, and consumed resources. Victory no longer belonged to the bravest. It belonged to those who could keep paying. This was the moment when power began to centralize. Local lords couldn't afford cannons. Small kingdoms couldn't maintain modern fortifications. Feudal obligations were insufficient for constant warfare. Only centralized states with predictable income could withstand this new reality. Gunpowder didn't just defeat fortresses, decentralization did too. When rulers realized that war now required money, they faced a new problem. Where would they find the money? Temporary taxes were no longer sufficient. Emergency taxes didn't support permanent armies. So states did something radical. They normalized taxation. What was once occasional became constant. What was once negotiated became the default. Subjects were no longer merely indebted for loyalty, they were indebted for money. Even that wasn't enough. Gunpowder wars were vast, long, and relentless. Cannons, gunpowder, ships, fortifications, and professional soldiers cost far more than could be covered by taxation alone. Therefore, governments turned to borrowing, not out of desperation, but as a strategy. This is where the financial system truly comes into play. States issued debt to finance war. bonds replaced flags, credit became a weapon, bankers and financiers replaced the nobility as the ruler's most important allies. A king who could borrow could wage war longer than one who couldn't, even if the latter was more popular. War was no longer limited to people. It became limited only to credit, and when wars could be financed, they could be extended beyond the limits of the people's endurance. The costs could be calculated over decades. Losses could be postponed. Inflation silently absorbed some of the burden. Entire populations could be financially mobilized without ever seeing the battlefield. This is the origin of the modern state: perpetual taxation, standing armies, public debt, centralized authority. None of this arose from abstract political theory. It emerged because gunpowder made war too expensive. Informally, fighting was compulsory. The human cost was enormous. Peasants paid higher taxes. Wages lagged behind prices. Inflation eroded savings. Debts outlived kings and were passed down to generations who hadn't voted for war or lived through it. And yet the system continued because it worked. Gunpowder reshaped the cost of war, and in doing so, forever reshaped the relationship between money and power. Once war became a permanent expense, states faced a problem they had never encountered on this scale before. They couldn't honestly pay for it. Raising taxes high enough to finance standing armies risked rebellion. Borrowing too much risked default. Cutting military spending meant falling behind rivals. So governments did something more subtle. They changed how the cost of war felt, and that's where inflation comes in. Not by chance, but by design. Inflation had existed for centuries. Ancient rulers closed up money to get through emergencies. But these events were dangerous, visible, and short-lived. When it went too far, confidence crumbled. Markets froze, regimes collapsed. The Gunpowder War changed the calculations. When war became permanent, states needed a way to spread the cost quietly, gradually, and among people who would never fight. Inflation did just that. Instead of directly obtaining value through taxes, governments indirectly obtained value by changing the value of money. The burden didn't disappear, it was resolved. Before gunpowder, inflation resolved events. After gunpowder, inflation systems took over. Cannons wore out. Gunpowder deteriorated. Fortresses required constant maintenance. Armies consumed resources every day they existed. Debt covered this deficit, but debt required repayment. Inflation silently reduced this burden. Creditors were paid nominally, but purchasing power decreased. The reaction was silent. The mechanism was invisible. War financed in this way became socially sustainable, and once this logic was in place, it wasn't limited to war. Military spending became permanent. Debts were carried over to the next year. Inflation became tolerable, even expected. Financial systems evolved not to eliminate these pressures, but to manage them. That's why modern states feel so resilient. Today, war is no longer limited by manpower, it's limited by budgets, aircraft carriers, satellites, cyber systems, logistics networks. These are as much financial obligations as military obligations. The question is no longer who fights best. The question is, who can afford to keep fighting? Restraint rarely stems solely from morality, it stems from cost. When that cost is absorbed, postponed, or concealed through financing, restraint weakens. This doesn't mean war is inevitable. It means war is structural. It lives within systems designed to make it sustainable. That's why debt, inflation, and public finances can never be separated from power struggles. They aren't abstract economic concepts, they are tools that allow states to demonstrate power without experiencing immediate collapse. Gunpowder taught rulers a brutal lesson. He who controls finance controls resilience. History doesn't repeat itself, but it progresses with a brutal consistency and rhyme. When technology raises the price of power, money steps in to bridge the gap. And once that bridge is built, it rarely crumbles. If this has given you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to look.